In this video I'm going to be building a 1/35 scale Panzer 1B by Takom. Hi my friends and welcome back to LPJ Models. The parts presented in the kit are really nice. There's some nice weld seams, rivet detail and some nice slide moulded stuff. All you can ask for really. It's all moulded in really high quality and there aren't many ejector pin marks or seam lines to deal with. Anyway, I've only given you a glancing look at the kit because I want to get stuck straight in with the build. As you'd expect for a vehicle like this, the construction starts with the lower hull tub and suspension assembly. The plastic glue I'm using throughout is VMS fast setting styrene cement. As long-term fans of the channel may know, I've already built a Panzer 1, but that one was huge compared to this, so I'm looking forward to building this mini version. Now the boxing for this kit contains two Panzer 1 models. The kit contains a Panzer 1A and this one, a Panzer 1B. But I will be focusing on the Panzer 1B for this build. The Panzer 1A is going to be used for something later down the line. Springs like this can be tricky to clean up, but luckily I've got a lazy trick up my sleeve. Once the spring is in place, I use plastic glue to melt away any parting lines. This technique sometimes needs a few passes, but it's pretty effective. Each road wheel comes with a photo-etched inner surround. To glue these in place, I used VMS Flexi 5K CA Black. It gives you enough working time to deal with photo etch parts, and you can also see it, which is a big bonus. In articles I've seen online, people filled in the ring around these to make them flush with the plastic surface. Because they were so small, I didn't bother, but in hindsight, that little bit of extra time spent would have ended up with a better result. The areas with the worst seam lines were the suspension bogies, and these needed a bit more attention and care whilst cleaning them up. For the top halves, I scraped away the excess with a scalpel, before carefully sanding them to blend them in smoothly. It always seems to be the suspension parts on a tank that require the most cleanup. Has anybody else noticed that? I also used the scalpel to remove any excess sprue gates, and then I scraped the surfaces clean. I didn't glue the bogie assemblies in place because I wanted to make it easier for painting down the line. So at this moment they're just pressed fitted into place. Well, once I could get my sausage fingers working. And with the suspension assembly pretty much done, it was time to move on to everybody's bane, the tracks. Now these aren't actually that bad because they're Lincoln length, but the individual track pieces are so tiny. I started by putting the larger assemblies in place, before gradually attaching the smaller assemblies. This was quite a handful and I needed to tape some of the tracks down in places to make sure they stayed put. But link by length I worked myself around the suspension assembly. And overall it didn't really take very long. And I think one of the biggest time-saving factors was that there were no ejector pin marks to clean up on any of the tracks, so I call that a bonus. Once the tracks were complete, it was time to move on to some of the other small, lower hull components. These tow hook things were really tiny and I did ping one into oblivion, but luckily there was a spare. Now, while the kit was mostly free from ejector pin marks, these on the underside of the fenders were pretty grim. I just used my sprue cutters to cut away the excess plastic and then sanded the area smooth. It's lucky these won't really be seen because I could have put a lot more effort into tidying them up. But you know, you gotta choose your battles. Whilst I was in the mood for removing parts, I also scraped away the fire extinguisher mount. This was because I bought a 1/16 scale STL for a fire extinguisher from a guy on Cults 3D and then scaled it down to 1/35. It had a bit more fidelity than the kit parts, so I was really pleased. And once it was all printed and cured and all that, it was glued in place with black super glue. There will be some more close-up shots of it later, I promise. I was debating whether to leave the tools off of this build to paint them separately, but in the end I just glued them all in place. Well, apart from the shovel, because I still wanted access to the axe, but anyway. This front plate was the only part of the build that needed any filler. I'm wondering whether the upper hull plate warped during the manufacturing process. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of because everything else fits so well. Anyway, the gaps were filled with AK white modelling putty. This was thinned slightly with water because my tube was drying out, and then brushed carefully into the cracks. Well, by carefully I mean liberally. Any excess was then cleaned up with a wet cotton bud. These lifting hooks were slightly overscale, so I needed to thin them out a bit. They were rubbed carefully on a sanding stick. And what you haven't seen here are the few that pinged off once again into eternity. To add some realism, the exhaust was texturised with some Mr. Surfacer 1500 grey. I'd usually use a coarser grade, but I had run out, but with a bit of time and a stiff brush I managed to get some extra texture on there. Now it's time for one of the moments of truth when it comes to armour modelling. Fixing the upper hull in place. This is one of those moments where you really hope you haven't got something out of whack. So let's see how we get on. After what seems like an eternity of gluing, I slid the upper hull into place. The fit was tight and you do have to slide it down towards the front of the tank, but the fit was brilliant. And in what is a massive sidestep for this channel, I actually took the time to add the mudguards to this vehicle. Small victories, eh? The shield for the exhaust was annealed with a lighter to make it easier to roll into shape. Once I'd had my pyro fix, I rolled it around the handle of a dental mirror because it was just about the right shape and size. The final parts of the construction took place around the turret. The viewports do come with arms so you can articulate them if you wish, but I'm doing this one buttoned up. In all, the construction for this kit was really simple, so it didn't take too long to do, which I really like. And to top it off, I was working on the Panzer 1A at the same time. I'm still saving that one for a later video though. And the build process is pretty much identical for both vehicles. So I guess it's now time for the best bit, or at least my favourite part, the painting. This was started by priming the entire vehicle in Mr. Surfacer 1500 black. This was thinned at around 40% Mr. Surfacer to 60% Mr. Levelling Thinner. It was also sprayed at around 15 psi. For the base colour of this build, I used AK Real Colour, Dunkelgrau, mixed with some MRP black. This was to make the base layer slightly darker so I'd have an even deeper shadow layer to work from. This was mixed with around 60% Mr. Levelling Thinner. I also sprayed it over the entirety of the model. No black basing this time. For the brown camo colour, I used AK Real Colour Dunkelbraun. Both of these colours came out of the AK Real Colour early war German tank set. These paints spray really nicely, especially when mixed with levelling thinner. And for this camo spraying, I thinned the paint down even more and knocked the pressure down to around 10 psi. Right, with that done, it's time to add some highlights. And this is where it gets a little bit similar to black basing. Over the Panzer grey areas, I used a mix of AK Dunkelgrau with MRP Extra Dark Sea Grey, and this was mottled over the entire surface for some juicy tonal variation. One thing I found slightly tricky with this technique was to make sure I went all the way up to the brown, so that I didn't leave a dark grey outline around the camouflage. This looks a bit extreme and bizarre at the moment, but by the time I get to the weathering stage, everything should have toned down nicely. The next step was to do the same with the dark brown. To make the highlight colour, I took the dark brown, mixed in some MRP German red brown and a little bit of pale wood. This was again highly thinned with levelling thinner. I think originally this camouflage is supposed to have a hard edge, but because the camouflage colours are so similar in brightness, it's often hard to distinguish in reference photos where the camouflage actually sits, so I decided it didn't matter too much. Anyway, here's something I don't do very often, a little bit of post shading. I drew around most, if not all of the details on the tank with a heavily thinned mix of MRP black and MRP German red brown. This was cut at around 90% thinner to 10% paint. I don't do this very often because I don't usually do it very well, but I took a chance and it came out alright. What I really like about it is that it added an extra layer of shadow and contrast to the paint finish. It doesn't look like it, but I think I should have gone heavier at this stage, because most of these effects will probably get lost at the end. After this experience, I'm less chicken when it comes to using post shading. I've had some horrendous experiences in the past with it, but this has given me a bit more confidence to try it in future builds. Next up was the detail painting, and I started with the tracks. I used my usual mix of a muddy light grey brown. I can't really tell you what colours I used because I kept adding colours to the pot until I was happy with it. But a good base is a Panzer grey with like a flat earth kind of colour. That gets you in the ballpark. For the tools, the wooden handles were based with Vallejo old wood. So I don't end up getting the same wood effect on every model I do like to mix up the base and top colour. Anyway, the top colour will come in a minute. The metallic sections of the tools were painted with some of the new Gen 2 Humbrol acrylics. I used a mix of gunmetal, dark earth and black to make a dark, worn steely colour. And this was carefully brushed on with my 2.0 Artis Opus Kalinsky Sable. I also used Humbrol gunmetal and black for the gun barrels. Gunmetal on its own was just a tad too bright, that's why I mixed it with the black. But I did use some gunmetal on its own to dry brush on some highlights. Oh, here's that top colour I was talking about. This time, to make my wood grain, I used Abteilung 502 Sepia. Probably now one of my most used oil paints. What I like about this colour, when used for wood grain, is it gives the tools a really grubby look. After about 20 minutes, when it had started to lose its shine, I brushed in a semblance of wood grain with an old tatty brush. But you can always check out my wood grain tutorial if you want a more in-depth guide. Jacks always seem to look a little worn, so over a dark steel colour, I used some Humbrol chipping and scratching agent to make some juicy chipping effects. This was followed by the base grey of the tank, before being chipped away with some warm water and an old tatty brush. Because of the similarity in colour, you can't really see any chipping here, so my bad. But there is some, it's just not very obvious. For the exhaust pipe, I didn't go down my usual route of using chipping fluid. Instead, I used some VMS Chip and Nick CN01, which is a rich rusty brown. Because of the removability of the chip and nick, I was able to paint roughly where I wanted the chips to go, and have the ability to tidy it up in a moment. So once the chip and nick had dried, I used the smart chipping agent to hone those chips. I was able to make the chipping look a bit more natural, as well as being able to remove any that I didn't quite like. This is quite a hassle-free way of chipping an exhaust pipe, considering usually I do a layer of red-brown, then some chipping fluid, and then some grey, and then work at it for ages. So yeah, pretty simple. Once I was happy with that, it was time to apply the decals, which, by the way, were pretty terrible. Any two-colour decals weren't in register whatsoever, so I had to change my initial paint scheme from a Poland campaign to a France campaign. But no drama. The decals were applied over a layer of VMS Decal Set and Fix. Once they were in place, any excess moisture and setting fluid was gently padded out with a cotton bud. Oh, and by the way, as usual, the decals were applied straight to paint because it's nice and smooth. Talking about the bad decals, if you take a close look at this yellow one, you can see it's fairly fuzzy around the edges. I don't know what that's all about, but I had to run with it. Oh, it's chipping time. To chip this model, I used some Humbrol 165 medium sea grey, and this was mixed with some VMS Slow-Mo acrylic paint auxiliary. This just keeps the paint workable for longer. Ideal for those days where the thermostat isn't going below 30 Celsius. Anyway, these chips were carefully brushed with my 2.0 Kolinsky sable. Because I haven't done brush tipping for a while, I've kind of lost the knack. All these techniques need to be practiced to be kept on top of. But luckily, they came out okay. The inners of the chips were filled with VMS Chip and Nick CN04. This is like a dark steely brown kind of colour, and I thought the extra contrast would make those chips pop. And to protect all of my hard work with the chipping and detail painting, I sealed the entire model with a layer of VMS Matte Varnish HD. Next up, I'm going to do some light airbrushed lacquer dusting. But for more variety, I'm going to wear this away with some Humbrol chipping and scratching agent. The entire model was coated with several light coats in preparation for some lacquers. And the lacquer in choice? This time I used Tamiya LP Flat Earth. This was thinned heavily with about 80% mister levelling thinner. And the dust effects were carefully and subtly built up in the areas where dust might collect. I kinda like how this dusting is looking without the chipping, to be honest, but I'll see it through to the end. I also added some dusting to the areas on the upper hull, again where the dust was most likely to collect. And once I was happy with that dusting, I started chipping away at it with some warm water and an old tatty brush. Remember not to use too much water because you can end up washing all of it away. Next up, it's time for a wash. Because the Panzer grey and brown was so dark, I decided to go with straight Abteilung 502 sepia. This was thinned with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light. I carefully brushed this around all the details in the panel lines, the screw heads, any areas that might want a bit of extra shadow. For the second wash, I used some AK sand yellow deposits. This was applied in a similar way to the sepia, but much more heavily thinned, and I also brushed some onto flat surfaces where dust might accumulate. Any excess of these sand deposits were blended in with a soft sable filbert brush. And when this was dry, I noticed I had some staining, so once again I scrubbed away at this with my soft brush, just to try and blend it in a bit more. The next step was to add some heavy dry earth and dust. For this I used MIG Splashes Effects Dry Step. This was brushed on relatively heavily in any cracks and crevices, and around the majority of the running gear. And before it had time to dry, it was blended with a soft brush. Right, let's tackle those tracks that I left half finished earlier. I used Mr. Metal Colour Chrome Silver to replicate the worn metal edges of the tracks. This was applied with a cotton bud carefully. And when the metallizer had dried, I used some MIG Ammo Tracks Wash, just to warm the tracks up a bit and add some grime. This was followed with a speckle of MIG Ammo Light Rust Wash. And once this was done, the tracks were carefully put in place before giving them a heavily thinned wash of that MIG Splashes Dry Step effect, just to blend everything together. To reinstate some contrast around the running gear and on the dusty areas, I applied another targeted wash of Abteilung 502 sepia. And of course I hadn't finished with the exhaust pipe yet. This was given a gentle wash with Abteilung 502 oxide patina. This was thinned again with VMS Universal Weathering Carrier Light, before, unusually for me, applying a few pigments. Since receiving these in my Humbrol pack, I wanted to give them a go. And what better way than to rust up an exhaust pipe. I used a mix of light and medium rust from the Humbrol weathering powders set, and this was gently dabbed in place with a very small brush. I didn't want to go overboard here, so I was careful with how much I used. This was followed by some smoke and some black effects, just to replicate some heat staining and exhaust fumes. Once I was happy with the pigment application, I gave everything a gentle blow just to remove any excess. I then used Abteilung 502 engine grease for some wet and grimy effects. This was lightly thinned again with universal weathering carrier, and in some areas I had to do several applications to keep the glossy shine up. This was mostly achieved with a mix of brushing and speckling, especially on the engine deck. One area I did pay special attention to was the exhaust pipe. Quite often fluid as well as smoke would spew out of these, at least I think, so I made sure to apply some greasy stains here as well. And for this build, that's pretty much it. I did forget the guard for the exhaust pipe, but I kinda like it without. Either way, I may put it on later, I may not. So what do you think of my Panzer 1B build? Please let me know in the comments below. What would you have done differently? And of course there's one final thing to do before we wrap this one up properly, and that's to give a huge thanks to my patrons. You guys are the best and I really appreciate the support. So to Patreon supporters old and new, thank you so much. And of course I'd like to thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and give the video a like if you liked it or a dislike if you didn't. Anyway, here are the gallery images supported with a sample from the wacky space opera me and Doug are writing at the moment. I'm James from LPJ Models. Thanks for watching.